The morning sun streamed through the massive windows of Chicago O'Hare International Airport's Terminal 3, casting long shadows across the polished floors. Dr. Wilson, a renowned cardiothoracic surgeon, adjusted his well-worn Howard University sweatshirt as he walked toward Gate K7. He'd just spent 3 days presenting his groundbreaking surgical techniques at a medical conference, and now all he wanted was to get home to San Francisco. Having traveled countless times for his work, he followed his usual routine, arriving early, grabbing a coffee from the Terminal Cafe, and settling in with the latest medical journal on his tablet. When the gate agent announced priority boarding for United Airlines Flight 2317, he gathered his carry-on and made his way to the front of the line, first-class ticket in hand. "Good morning," he said warmly to the gate agent, who barely glanced at him before mechanically scanning his boarding pass. The subtle shift in her expression didn't escape his notice, that fleeting look of surprise he'd grown painfully familiar with over the years. As he walked down the jet bridge, Dr. Wilson mentally prepared himself for what often came next. He'd been in this situation before, countless times. 20 years of being one of the top surgeons in the country hadn't changed these moments. Stepping onto the aircraft, he was greeted by a flight attendant whose professional smile faltered slightly. "Sir, are you sure you're on the right flight?" she asked, despite having just watched him board with a scanned ticket. "Yes, I am," he replied patiently, showing his boarding pass again. "Seat 2A. The flight attendant examined his ticket with unusual scrutiny. "Let me double-check that for you," she said, holding up the line while she verified what was clearly printed on his boarding pass. Behind him, other first-class passengers started boarding, receiving warm welcomes and being ushered to their seats without any verification beyond a quick glance at their tickets. A businessman in an expensive suit breezed past, the same flight attendant greeting him with genuine warmth. Dr. Wilson finally made his way to his seat, placing his small carry-on in the overhead compartment. He'd packed light, as always, bringing just what he needed for the medical conference. As he settled into 2A, he noticed another flight attendant whispering to her colleague, both glancing in his direction. Moments later, that same flight attendant approached. "Sir, could I see your boarding pass one more time? We need to ensure proper passenger distribution." This was the third time his ticket had been checked, while other passengers around him sipped their pre-flight beverages, undisturbed. Dr. Wilson took a deep breath, maintaining his composure. He'd learned long ago that showing any sign of frustration would only make things worse. He wordlessly handed over his ticket again, watching as the flight attendant's eyes widened slightly at his title. Other passengers were filing past now, some casting curious glances at the repeated ticket checks. A few seemed uncomfortable witnessing the situation, quickly averting their eyes, while others watched with barely concealed interest. When the drink service began for first-class passengers, Dr. Wilson noticed every other seat in his cabin received prompt attention. The flight attendants moved efficiently, offering beverages and hanging jackets, yet somehow managing to repeatedly overlook his raised hand. He thought about the irony of it all, how in just a few hours he was scheduled to give a guest lecture at Stanford Medical School about his innovative cardiac surgery technique, the same technique that had saved hundreds of lives and was now being taught in medical schools across the country. Yet here he sat, being treated as if he somehow didn't belong in a seat he'd rightfully purchased. Finally, after watching several rounds of beverage service pass him by, he pressed the call button. The senior flight attendant appeared, her professional mask firmly in place, but her eyes conveying clear annoyance. "Is there something you need, sir?" she asked, emphasizing the last word in a way that made it sound less like a courtesy and more like an afterthought. "Yes, I'd like a glass of water, please," he said quietly, noting how her expression shifted when she heard his educated, articulate tone. It was another familiar moment, that subtle reassessment that happened when he spoke, the slight adjustment in how he was perceived. As the boarding process continued around him, Dr. Wilson pulled out his medical journal again, trying to focus on an article about new developments in minimally invasive surgery. But his mind kept drifting to his younger patients, especially the kids he treated at the children's hospital. He'd always told them that education and excellence were the great equalizers. Now sitting in his first-class seat while being treated like an unwelcome intruder, he wondered how many more generations would have to face these same battles. The tension in first class grew thicker as more passengers settled into their seats. Dr. Wilson noticed how the senior flight attendant kept finding reasons to hover near his seat, straightening already perfect seat pocket magazines or adjusting the overhead bins that didn't need adjusting. Her presence felt less like service and more like surveillance. A young couple across the aisle watched the situation unfold while pretending to be absorbed in their phones. The husband occasionally glanced up, his discomfort evident in the way he shifted in his seat. His wife whispered something to him, both of them wearing expressions that mixed concern with uncertainty about whether they should speak up. The flight attendant's voice carried clearly as she spoke to another crew member near the galley. "We need to maintain proper passenger distribution," she said, loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. "It's about balance and comfort for everyone." The pointed looks in Dr. Wilson's direction made it clear what kind of balance she was referring to. When the pre-flight service began, the flight attendant's behavior became even more obvious. She moved smoothly through the cabin, offering warm greetings and taking drink orders from other passengers. "Would you care for champagne?" she asked a businessman in 2B, "perhaps some sparkling water with lemon." To the lady in 1A, each interaction was accompanied by a genuine smile and attentive service. But when she reached Dr. Wilson's seat, her demeanor changed completely. "Drinks will be served after takeoff," she said curtly, without making eye contact, before quickly moving on. The contrast was so stark that an elderly gentleman across the aisle raised his eyebrows in surprise. Dr. Wilson pulled out his phone, considering whether to document what was happening. He'd seen enough viral videos of similar situations to know how these things could escalate. But that wasn't his style. He'd spent his entire career building bridges rather than burning them, finding ways to change minds through his work and presence rather than confrontation. The cabin continued to fill as economy passengers filed past. Some did double takes at the ongoing situation in first class, a few even slowing their pace to watch. A flight attendant quickly urged them to keep moving, as if trying to prevent witnesses from lingering too long. "Sir," the senior flight attendant approached again, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness, "are you sure you wouldn't be more comfortable in another section? We have some excellent seats available in Economy Plus." She gestured toward the back of the plane, where several passengers were still getting settled. Dr. Wilson looked up from his medical journal, his voice calm but firm. "I'm quite comfortable right here in the seat I purchased, thank you." He held her gaze steadily, years of handling high-pressure situations in the operating room evident in his composed demeanor. A younger flight attendant, new to the crew judging by her uncertain manner, watched this interaction with visible discomfort. She seemed torn between following her senior colleague's lead and her own sense of right and wrong. When she caught Dr. Wilson's eye, she gave him an apologetic look before quickly busying herself with the safety demonstration equipment. The businessman in 2B, who had been pretending to be absorbed in his laptop, finally closed his screen and cleared his throat. "Excuse me," he began, addressing the senior flight attendant, "but is there some sort of problem here?" His tone suggested he knew exactly what the problem was and didn't approve. The flight attendant's professional mask slipped for just a moment, revealing a flash of annoyance at being questioned. "Not at all, sir," she replied smoothly. "We're simply ensuring all our passengers are properly accommodated." She emphasized the word properly while giving Dr. Wilson another pointed look. Dr. Wilson pulled out his tablet again, opening his presentation slides for tomorrow's lecture at Stanford. The irony wasn't lost on him. Here he was, preparing to teach the next generation of surgeons about breaking barriers in medical science, while experiencing the same old barriers himself. More passengers were now openly watching the situation unfold. Some had their phones out, though they tried to be discreet about it. The atmosphere in the cabin had become charged with unspoken tension, like a storm building before the rain. The senior flight attendant made one more pass by his seat, this time straightening the safety card in his seat pocket that didn't need straightening. "Just remember, sir," she said in a voice that managed to be both professional and condescending, "if you need anything during the flight, don't hesitate to ask." The way she said it made it clear she hoped he wouldn't ask for anything at all. Dr. Wilson simply nodded, maintaining his dignity in the face of the increasingly uncomfortable situation. He'd learned long ago that his greatest power lay not in reacting to prejudice, but in refusing to let it define him. Still, as the final boarding announcements were made, he couldn't help but wonder how many more times he would have to prove he belonged in spaces he had rightfully earned his place in. The situation reached its boiling point just as the final boarding announcements were being made. The senior flight attendant, who had been hovering around Dr. Wilson's seat throughout boarding, approached one final time. This time she wasn't alone. She had brought the lead purser with her, a tall man with graying hair and an air of authority. "Sir," the purser began, his voice carefully neutral but carrying an edge of condescension, "there seems to be some confusion about seating arrangements in first class today." He glanced down at a tablet in his hands, though Dr. Wilson's boarding pass had already been checked multiple times. Several passengers nearby had stopped pretending not to notice. A woman in her mid-50s pulled out her phone and began openly recording, while a young professional couple exchanged worried glances. The businessman in 2B had put away his laptop entirely, now fully focused on the unfolding scene. Dr. Wilson took a deep breath, maintaining the same calm demeanor that had served him well in countless high-pressure surgeries. "There's no confusion," he replied evenly. "I'm in seat 2A, exactly as shown on my boarding pass, which has been verified 4 times now." The purser shifted uncomfortably, clearly not expecting such a composed and articulate response. "Yes, well," he continued, lowering his voice, "we've had some concerns raised about proper passenger distribution and comfort levels in this cabin." A murmur of disbelief rippled through the first-class section. The woman recording the interaction let out an audible scoff. "Are you serious right now?" she asked loudly, her phone still pointed at the scene. "We all know exactly what this is about." The senior flight attendant shot the woman a sharp look. "Ma'am, recording is not permitted during flight preparations," she said, though there was no such rule about recording during boarding. Dr. Wilson sat up straighter in his seat, his voice remaining steady but taking on a firmer tone. "Let me be very clear," he said, looking directly at the purser. "I am a paying first-class passenger. I have shown my boarding pass multiple times. I have been patient with the repeated checks and barely concealed hostility. But this needs to stop now." The young flight attendant who had shown discomfort earlier hung back near the galley, watching with visible distress. She whispered something to another crew member who shook her head in apparent disagreement with what was happening. "Sir," the purser tried again, "perhaps we could offer you an upgrade to our Economy Plus section. It's quite comfortable and—" "An upgrade?" Dr. Wilson interrupted, finally allowing a hint of incredulity to enter his voice. "You're suggesting I upgrade from first class to Economy Plus?" The absurdity of the statement hung in the air. The businessman in 2B stood up. "This is ridiculous," he declared, addressing the purser directly. "I've been flying this airline for 20 years, and I've never seen such blatant—" "Please, sir," the purser cut him off, "this is a matter between our crew and the passenger in question." More phones had appeared throughout the cabin. The scene was being captured from multiple angles now, despite the flight attendant's attempts to discourage recording. A teenager in economy, passing by on his way to the bathroom, stopped to watch with wide eyes before being shooed along. Dr. Wilson reached into his bag and pulled out his Stanford Medical School guest lecturer badge. "I don't make a habit of this," he said quietly, "but since you seem so concerned about who belongs in this cabin—" He placed the badge on his tray table, alongside his first-class boarding pass. The purser's face flushed as he read the credentials. The senior flight attendant, who had been standing with crossed arms, suddenly found great interest in adjusting her uniform cuff. The quiet that fell over the cabin was deafening. A voice from a few rows back broke the silence. "My daughter had heart surgery last year," an older man called out. "At Stanford. Are you the doctor who developed the new minimally invasive technique?" Before Dr. Wilson could respond, the purser quickly tried to regain control of the situation. "Sir, we apologize for any inconvenience. Of course, you may remain in your assigned seat. We'll be beginning our departure preparations shortly." But the damage was done. The atmosphere in the cabin had shifted from tension to something else, a mix of embarrassment, anger, and realization. Several passengers were shaking their heads in disgust at the crew's behavior. The woman with the phone was now typing furiously, presumably sharing the video she'd captured. The young flight attendant finally stepped forward. "I'll be handling service for this section during our flight today," she announced, her voice shaking slightly but determined. She gave Dr. Wilson a genuine smile, the first he'd received since boarding. As the purser and senior flight attendant retreated to the galley, Dr. Wilson sat back in his seat, physically and emotionally drained. He could hear the whispers spreading through the cabin, passengers sharing their disbelief at what they'd witnessed. But his mind was already elsewhere, thinking about the young medical students he'd be teaching tomorrow, and hoping that someday they would live in a world where such incidents would be nothing more than cautionary tales from the past. 2 hours into the flight, the atmosphere in the cabin had settled into an uneasy calm. Dr. Wilson had managed to review most of his presentation slides, though the earlier confrontation still weighed heavily on his mind. The young flight attendant who had taken over the first-class service was doing her best to make up for her colleague's behavior, offering him extra attention that he politely but firmly declined. The plane cruised smoothly at 35,000 feet somewhere over the Midwest when the first signs of trouble appeared. A commotion arose from the economy section, raised voices and the sound of someone in distress. Most passengers barely noticed at first, used to the occasional cry of a baby or loud conversation. But then came the sound that every medical professional recognizes, the urgent call of someone in genuine need. "Help! Is anyone here a doctor?" The voice was tinged with panic, cutting through the drone of the engines. Dr. Wilson's head snapped up from his tablet. Years of emergency room experience had conditioned him to respond instantly to such calls. For a split second, he remembered the humiliation from earlier, the questioning of his presence in first class, the attempts to move him to economy. The call came again, more desperate this time. "Please, we need a doctor. My husband, something's wrong." Without hesitation, Dr. Wilson pressed his call button. The young flight attendant appeared quickly. "There's a medical emergency," he asked, already standing up. Her eyes widened with recognition and relief. "Yes, in economy, row 23. A passenger is having chest pains." Dr. Wilson moved swiftly through the cabin, past the same senior flight attendant who had tried to remove him from first class. Her face showed a mix of surprise and embarrassment as he passed. The purser, standing in the galley, stepped aside wordlessly. In row 23, a middle-aged man was slumped in his seat, his face ashen and covered in sweat. His wife gripped his hand, fear evident in her eyes. Other passengers had turned in their seats to watch, their expressions a mix of concern and curiosity. "I'm a doctor," Dr. Wilson announced calmly, kneeling in the tight space beside the sick passenger. "Can you tell me what you're feeling?" The man struggled to speak between labored breaths. Chest, tight, left arm, numb. Each word seemed to cost him tremendous effort. Dr. Wilson's training kicked in immediately. "I need the plane's medical kit," he called out to the flight attendants. "And bring me all the aspirin you have on board." His voice carried the quiet authority of someone used to commanding emergency rooms. The young flight attendant rushed to comply, while the senior one stood frozen, watching the doctor she had tried to dismiss now take charge of a life-or-death situation. The purser had appeared with a clipboard, presumably to document the incident. "Sir, can you raise your arms for me?" Dr. Wilson asked, already checking the man's pulse. It was rapid and irregular, not a good sign. "Have you had any history of heart problems?" The man's wife answered, her voice shaking. "He had a stent put in last year. He's supposed to take his medication, but—" The medical kit arrived, and Dr. Wilson opened it with practiced efficiency. 20 years of cardiac surgery had taught him exactly what to look for. He pulled out the portable blood pressure cuff while directing the flight attendants. "I need space cleared in the galley. If this is what I think it is, we'll need to lay him flat." Passengers in nearby rows unbuckled their seatbelts, ready to help if needed. The atmosphere in the cabin had transformed, the early attention replaced by a focused energy as everyone watched the doctor work. "Get on the radio to the ground," Dr. Wilson instructed the purser. "Tell them we have a passenger with a possible heart attack in progress. We may need to divert." His hands moved quickly but calmly as he took the man's blood pressure. The same senior flight attendant who had questioned his presence in first class now stood ready to assist, her earlier attitude completely transformed. "What do you need, doctor?" she asked, her voice notably more respectful than it had been during boarding. Dr. Wilson didn't have time to appreciate the irony. "Help me get him to the galley. We need him flat, and I need better light to examine him." He turned to the worried wife. "Ma'am, I'm a cardiothoracic surgeon. Your husband may be having a heart attack, but we're going to do everything we can for him right here." As they carefully moved the patient, other passengers helped clear the way. The young teenager who had witnessed the earlier confrontation now held his phone light up to provide better visibility. The businessman from first class had come back to offer his help. In the galley, Dr. Wilson worked with the same precise focus he brought to his operating room. "Aspirin first," he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. "Then we'll check his oxygen levels." He glanced at the increasingly worried flight attendants. "How long until we can land?" The purser returned with news from the cockpit. "Pilots radioing for emergency clearance. Nearest airport is about 30 minutes away." Dr. Wilson nodded, his attention never leaving his patient. 30 minutes, he repeated softly. "Well, sir, looks like you and I are going to get to know each other pretty well in the next half hour." Despite the seriousness of the situation, he managed a reassuring smile for both the patient and his frightened wife. The entire cabin seemed to hold its breath, watching as the doctor they had witnessed being humiliated earlier now worked to save a life, showing more concern for his patient's dignity than anyone had shown for his own. The galley had transformed into a makeshift emergency room. Dr. Wilson knelt beside the patient, who lay flat on the floor with a makeshift pillow under his head. The doctor's face showed intense concentration as he monitored the man's vital signs, his earlier mistreatment by the crew seemingly forgotten in the urgency of the moment. "Blood pressure still dropping," he announced to the flight attendants assisting him. "We need to start an IV." His hands moved with practiced precision as he opened the emergency medical kit wider, quickly locating the IV supplies. The senior flight attendant, who had earlier tried to remove him from first class, now held the flashlight steady, her hands trembling slightly. The patient's wife watched anxiously, gripping the handle of a nearby jump seat. "Will he be okay?" Her voice quivered with fear. Other passengers crowded the nearby aisle, some offering silent prayers, others holding phones ready to help with additional light if needed. Dr. Wilson spoke in a calm, reassuring tone while preparing the IV. "He's having what we call a myocardial infarction, a heart attack. But the good news is we caught it early, and I'm going to do everything I can to help him." His voice carried the quiet confidence of someone who had handled countless similar situations. The young flight attendant returned with the radio handset. "Doctor, we have a cardiologist on the ground line. They want to consult with you." Without looking up from his work, Dr. Wilson began relaying information in precise medical terms, describing symptoms and current readings. The other doctor on the line seemed surprised by his expertise, and there was a noticeable shift in their conversation when Dr. Wilson mentioned his role at Stanford. The patient's showing classic signs of anterior wall MI, he explained while skillfully inserting the IV. "I've started him on the aspirin protocol, but his pressure's still concerning." He glanced at the portable blood pressure monitor again. "We're going to need emergency services ready the moment we land." The plane hit a pocket of turbulence, causing everyone to sway. Dr. Wilson steadied himself while keeping the IV line secure. "How much longer until we land?" he asked the purser, who was coordinating with the cockpit. 20 minutes to the nearest airport," came the response. "They've cleared all other traffic for our emergency landing." The patient groaned, his face contorted in pain. Dr. Wilson immediately turned his full attention back to him. "Stay with me, sir. I know it hurts, but I need you to keep talking to me. Tell me about your grandchildren. Your wife mentioned you have 3? As the patient struggled to speak about his grandkids, Dr. Wilson kept working. He had the flight attendants rearrange the galley supplies to create more space, turning the cramped area into a more functional treatment space. The same crew members who had questioned his presence in first class now jumped to follow his every instruction without hesitation. The businessman from first class had made his way back to help. "I'm certified in basic first aid," he offered. "Can I assist?" Dr. Wilson nodded gratefully, directing him to help monitor the patient's pulse while he prepared additional medication from the kit. Suddenly, the patient's condition worsened. His eyes rolled back, and the blood pressure monitor started beeping frantically. the cabin filled with gasps of concern from watching passengers. Dr. Wilson's expression remained focused and calm, though his actions took on greater urgency. "He's going into shock," he announced, reaching for more supplies from the medical kit. "I need everyone to step back and give us space." His voice carried both authority and reassurance, a tone that made people listen and comply without question. The next few minutes were intense. Dr. Wilson worked with practiced efficiency, administering medication through the IV while constantly monitoring vital signs. He spoke softly to the patient throughout, his voice steady and encouraging, even as his hands moved with urgent purpose. The young teenager who had witnessed the earlier confrontation in first class watched wide-eyed from a nearby seat. "My mom's a nurse," he whispered to his seatmate. "She says you can tell a real doctor by how calm they stay in an emergency." The senior flight attendant, still holding the flashlight, had tears in her eyes as she watched Dr. Wilson work. The contrast between her earlier treatment of him and his current life-saving efforts couldn't have been more stark. Finally, the numbers on the blood pressure monitor began to stabilize. Dr. Wilson let out a small sigh of relief, though he didn't relax his vigilance. "We're not out of the woods," he explained to the patient's wife, "but he's responding to treatment. The emergency team will be waiting when we land, and they'll take him straight to the cardiac unit." The pilot's voice came over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, please return to your seats and fasten your seatbelts. We're beginning our emergency descent." Dr. Wilson secured the IV line and made sure the patient was stable for landing. As he worked, passengers who had witnessed both his humiliation during boarding and his heroics now couldn't help but marvel at his professionalism and grace under pressure. The same hands that had been questioned about belonging in first class were now the only thing standing between a man and death at 35,000 feet. As the plane began its emergency descent, word of what was happening in the galley had spread throughout the cabin. Passengers whispered to each other, sharing details about the doctor who had stepped up to save a life, the same doctor who had been treated so poorly during boarding. The teenager who had been watching everything unfold was scrolling through his phone, his eyes growing wider by the second. "Oh my gosh," he said loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. "Look at this." He turned his phone to show his seatmate an article from a medical journal. "He's that doctor. The one who invented the new heart surgery technique. They're teaching it in medical schools now." The news spread through the cabin like wildfire. A woman a few rows back gasped as she pulled up her own phone. "I just found his TED talk," she announced. "He's one of the top heart surgeons in the country. He's pioneered procedures that have saved thousands of lives." The senior flight attendant, still holding the flashlight in the galley, overheard these conversations. Her face flushed with shame as she watched Dr. Wilson continue to work tirelessly over his patient, checking vital signs and adjusting the IV drip with careful precision. A businessman in the front row was now showing his tablet to other passengers. "Look at this," he was just featured in Stanford Medical's newsletter. "He's revolutionized how they perform certain types of heart surgery, makes it less invasive, faster recovery time. It's incredible." The purser, who had earlier questioned Dr. Wilson's presence in first class, stood in the galley doorway, his expression a mix of embarrassment and awe. He watched as the doctor calmly explained each step of what he was doing to the patient's worried wife, his manner both professional and deeply compassionate. "How's his pressure?" Dr. Wilson asked the businessman helping him, completely focused on his patient and unaware of the revelations spreading through the cabin. "Stable at 110/70, came the reply. The businessman added quietly, "Doctor, I had no idea you were. I mean, I should have spoken up earlier when they—" Dr. Wilson shook his head, cutting off the apology. "Right now, all that matters is getting this man safely to a hospital." His dedication to his patient's care spoke volumes about his character, more than any medical journal article or professional accolade ever could. The young flight attendant who had taken over first-class service was now helping coordinate with the ground crew through the cockpit. As she passed messages back and forth, she couldn't help but overhear passengers discussing Dr. Wilson's achievements. Each new detail made the earlier treatment of him seem even more appalling. "He developed that procedure that saved my nephew last year," an elderly passenger realized aloud, her voice thick with emotion. The doctor said if it wasn't for this new technique, she wiped tears from her eyes as she watched Dr. Wilson work. The teenager had found more information. "Look at this. He runs a free clinic in underserved communities," he told anyone who would listen. "And he teaches medical students for free. He's like a real-life hero." In the galley, Dr. Wilson remained focused on his patient, whose color was slowly improving. The wife had been shown the articles about him on passengers' phones, and she now watched him with a new level of hope and gratitude. "Doctor," she whispered, "I had no idea we had someone like you on board. We're so fortunate." Dr. Wilson simply smiled kindly at her. "We're not done yet," he said gently. "Let's focus on getting your husband safely to the hospital." His humility in the face of his now revealed accomplishments only served to highlight the injustice of his earlier treatment. The senior flight attendant had finally found her voice. "Doctor, we." She struggled to find the right words, clearly overwhelmed by the magnitude of their earlier mistake. "Please," he said quietly, checking the IV line again, "just help me keep him stable until we land." His response to her attempted apology, choosing to focus on saving a life rather than dwelling on past mistreatment, spoke volumes about his character. More passengers had found articles and videos about him online. They learned about his research, his teaching, his volunteer work. The contrast between his actual identity and how he had been treated became starker with each new revelation. 10 minutes to landing, the pilot's voice announced over the intercom. The cabin buzzed with whispered conversations as passengers shared their discoveries about the doctor's achievements with each other. Many were recording the scene, documenting how the man they had watched being humiliated was now being revealed as one of the most respected doctors in his field. Through it all, Dr. Wilson maintained his focus on his patient, his dedication unwavering. His actions spoke louder than any medical journal article or professional accolade. Here was a man who, despite facing discrimination and prejudice, chose to rise above it all to save a life. The real revelation wasn't just about his professional achievements, but about the character of the man himself. The emergency landing was smooth despite the rush. As soon as the plane touched down, emergency vehicles with flashing lights could be seen lining the runway. Dr. Wilson had stayed with his patient throughout the descent, monitoring his vital signs and keeping him stable during the landing. As paramedics boarded the plane, Dr. Wilson briefed them with professional precision. Male patient, mid-60s, anterior wall NI. Started on aspirin protocol approximately 40 minutes ago. Blood pressure stabilized but still needs immediate cardiac care. The paramedics listened intently, their respect evident as they recognized they were being briefed by a top cardiac surgeon. The airline's ground crew had brought a wheelchair, but Dr. Wilson shook his head. "He needs to stay flat. Let's use the gunny." His tone was firm but polite, the same quiet authority he'd maintained throughout the emergency, despite everything that had happened earlier. As the patient was carefully transferred to the gunny, his wife gripped Dr. Wilson's hand. "How can we ever thank you?" she asked, tears in her eyes. "If you hadn't been on this flight," she couldn't finish the sentence. "The cardiac unit here has an excellent reputation," Dr. Wilson assured her. "They'll take good care of him." He wrote something on a business card and handed it to her. "Have them call me if they need any information about his treatment during the flight." The entire plane watched in silence as the patient was wheeled out. The same senior flight attendant who had tried to move Dr. Wilson to economy class now stood with her head bowed, unable to meet his eyes. The purser looked equally uncomfortable, shifting from foot to foot near the galley. As the paramedics left with the patient, the airline's regional manager boarded the plane. He'd been notified about both the medical emergency and the earlier incident during boarding. His face was grave as he approached Dr. Wilson. "Doctor," he began, his voice carrying through the quiet cabin, "on behalf of the airline, I want to express our deepest apologies for the treatment you received today. It was unacceptable, and we will be conducting a full investigation." Dr. Wilson nodded quietly, but his attention was still on the door where his patient had been taken out. "Just make sure he and his wife have support at the hospital. They're in a city they don't know." The teenage passenger who had researched Dr. Wilson earlier spoke up from his seat. "The video's already going viral," he announced. "People can't believe how they treated you, and then you saved that man's life." Indeed, phones throughout the cabin had captured both the earlier discrimination and the doctor's life-saving intervention. Several passengers had already shared their recordings on social media, where the story was spreading rapidly. The regional manager looked even more concerned. "Doctor, we would like to offer you lifetime premium status, and of course, any flights you need in the future." Dr. Wilson finally turned to face him fully. "What I'd like," he said in a clear, steady voice that carried throughout the cabin, "is for you to implement better training for your staff. This isn't about me, it's about making sure this doesn't happen to anyone else." A scattered applause broke out among the passengers. The businessman from first class stood up. "I'm a corporate trainer," he announced. "Doctor, if you're willing, I'd like to use this incident as a case study for our diversity programs. People need to see this." The young flight attendant who had shown kindness throughout the flight stepped forward. "I'd like to be part of that training," she said firmly. "We need to do better." The airline manager nodded earnestly. "Yes, absolutely. Doctor, would you be willing to consult with us on developing these programs?" Dr. Wilson picked up his medical journal from where he'd left it during the emergency. "Send me a proposal," he said quietly. "Right now, I need to update my presentation for tomorrow. I'm teaching a class of medical students about breaking down barriers in healthcare." As arrangements were made to continue the flight's journey, passengers approached Dr. Wilson one by one. Some wanted to thank him, others to apologize for not speaking up earlier. Many shared stories of their own experiences with discrimination or how his medical innovations had helped their loved ones. The senior flight attendant finally found the courage to approach him directly. "Doctor," she began, her voice trembling, "I don't expect forgiveness, but I want you to know that you've changed how I'll treat every passenger from now on." Dr. Wilson looked at her thoughtfully. "Then something good came from all this," he replied simply. "Sometimes the hardest lessons leave the deepest impact." As the flight prepared to resume its journey, news of what had happened was spreading across social media and news outlets. But Dr. Wilson simply returned to his seat in first class, where no one questioned his presence now, and opened his laptop to finish preparing for tomorrow's lecture. He had always believed that the best response to prejudice was excellence, and today had proven that in ways he never expected. The incident would go on to spark major changes in airline training policies, become a case study in corporate diversity programs, and inspire countless discussions about bias in everyday situations. But perhaps its greatest impact was on the individuals who witnessed it firsthand, from the crew members who learned a powerful lesson about prejudice, to the passengers who were reminded never to stay silent in the face of injustice, to the medical students who would hear the story in tomorrow's lecture about breaking down barriers in medicine.